In part one of the build-up to the Civil War, we left off in 1845. The United States had greatly expanded its territory west of the Mississippi River and maintained a tentative peace through a series of compromises, leading to a nation evenly divided between slave states in the south and free states in the north. Compromise had also provided a temporary respite in the struggle between state and federal power. Deep divisions remained, however. A new group, the abolitionists, had arisen, arguing that slavery was a sin and must therefore be abandoned completely and immediately. And South Carolina had threatened to secede from the country in opposition to federal authority. In part two, we will pick up the story in 1846 and take it through the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. In 1846, the United States found itself at war with its southern neighbor, Mexico. Tensions between the two nations had been on the rise as the United States expanded to the west. Some of the causes of the war were: Americans in the Mexican state of Texas rebelled and won their independence and then joined the United States. Americans in California had also led a revolution against Mexico. There were continuing border disputes between the two nations, and many Northerners suspected that the war was started by Southerners who saw the opportunity to add more territory for slavery to expand. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo formally brought an end to the Mexican-American War in 1848, and as a result, the U.S. gained the new territories of New Mexico and California, known as the Mexican Cession. Once again, the question of slavery in the territories arose. The Senate erupted in highly emotional, violent debate, bringing the workings of the government to a halt. There were several proposed solutions. President Polk proposed that the Missouri Compromise line simply be extended to the Pacific. Pennsylvania's Democratic representative, David Wilmot, proposed prohibiting of slavery in any territories acquired from Mexico, considering that Mexico had not allowed for the practice of slavery in the first place. The Wilmot Proviso, as it came to be known, enjoyed near unanimous approval in the North. South Carolina's John C. Calhoun declared that Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the Southwest. Congress must protect the rights of citizens and their property in all territories. He based his argument on the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees that no citizen shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Seen here is Stephen A. Douglas, a young Democratic senator from Illinois, who proposed the idea of popular sovereignty. Under this proposal, the people of each territory, rather than Congress, would decide whether or not to permit slavery in their territory. While this debate intensified, there was a presidential election in 1848. Neither dominant party, the Democrats or the Whigs, took any stand at all on slavery, which was the most pressing issue facing the nation at that time. Neither party could address slavery because both were made up of both Northerners and Southerners, and to take any stand on the issue of slavery would bring about the disintegration of their parties. This brought about the formation of a third party, the Free Soil Party, which was made up primarily of Northerners. Founded on the ideals of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men, the party campaigned against the expansion of slavery into the territory acquired from Mexico, and they chose as their candidate former President Martin Van Buren, seen here on the left. The most significant impact of the Free Soil Party was that they captured enough Democratic votes to hand the election to the Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, a military hero from the Mexican-American War. Meanwhile, back in Congress, a group of young senators, including Stephen A. Douglas, met and tried to iron out a compromise. They worked out a package deal and convinced Henry Clay of Kentucky to present it for them. Clay had been in government for nearly 40 years by that point and was one of the great statesmen of his time. He agreed to their request, and in January of 1850, he offered to the Senate a series of compromise measures, 4 separate bills, none of which could be passed by itself, but together they might be passed as a package. It was all of them or none. As a compromise bill, there has to be something for each side in order to ensure its passage. The first of the four bills would admit California as a free state. Which side of the debate, the free North or the slave South, was happy about this proposal? The second bill would recognize the New Mexico and Utah territories as neither slave nor free. The people of these territories would make that determination for themselves under Stephen Douglas's proposal of popular sovereignty. Which side of the debate, the free North or the slave South, was happy about this proposal? The third bill would prohibit the buying, selling, transporting for sale, and public auction of slaves in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. It did not prohibit the practice of slavery, just the slave trade. Which side of the debate, the free North or the slave South, would be happy about this proposal? Which side of the debate is still waiting for a proposal that would appeal to them? The final bill was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. A fugitive slave was now considered a matter of interstate commerce and therefore a federal offense and fully under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Any federal official could apprehend a fugitive without requiring the aid of state officials. No trial or testimony was required because slaves were not citizens. All that was required was some means of identification, such as a scar, tattoo, or eyewitness testimony. This was a fugitive slave law with teeth, and for runaway slaves, it meant that reaching a free state no longer assured their freedom. Responses to the Compromise Bill were varied and passionate. Daniel Webster spoke out in favor of the compromise and scolded extremists on either side. He argued that compromise was the only solution and the only way to preserve the Union. South Carolina's John C. Calhoun, whose speech had to be delivered by a surrogate because he was dying of cancer, responded that there could be no deal, no compromise, no concession. Slavery was a positive moral good and, as a basic right, was not up for further discussion. Two important deaths influenced the passage of the compromise package. Calhoun died on March 31, 1850, removing an important force opposing the compromise. Many Southerners did not think the compromise was so bad, but who was going to oppose the old man? His death loosened up a good deal of opposition in the South. Secondly, President Taylor died in June. He had opposed the compromise, but his vice president, now President Millard Fillmore, had presided over the Senate hearings and felt that the compromise was a good one. He took an active role in supporting and encouraging the passage of this legislation. So, in September of 1850, the compromise bills were passed into law. Many now felt that the slavery as an issue was over. Congress would not touch slavery with a 10-foot pole because it was a no-win situation. A conspiracy of silence settled in. If you won't touch it, I won't touch it, senators said to themselves. Despite the conspiracy of silence, slavery remained a potent issue. By 1856, Harriet Tubman, a former slave who had escaped to freedom, had made 19 trips back into slave territory to guide runaways to the north, risking her own recapture and re-enslavement in doing so. The Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and people opposed to slavery, not only continued but expanded. The new fugitive slave law changed the destination to Canada, where slavery was prohibited by British law. Southerners demanded the new law's enforcement, while Northerners resented it. In Boston, a former slave named Shadrach Minkins was apprehended and jailed. A group of free blacks broke him out of jail and took him to Canada. Bostonians offered free legal support to those who were involved. And then in 1854, Anthony Burns was apprehended in Boston while serving as a waiter at the Parker House. He was brought to court where the judge ordered him to be returned to his owner. Emotions ran high, and military forces had to be called out to ensure the deliverance of Burns to the waterfront for transportation. U.S. cavalry and artillery units lined the streets. Frederick Douglass, another escaped slave, became an outspoken abolitionist and often spoke publicly about the evils of slavery. His autobiography was one of the first slave narratives. Harriet Jacobs had also escaped slavery. Her autobiography illustrated slavery from a woman's point of view. Solomon Northrop was a free man who was kidnapped into slavery and rescued 12 years later. His narrative was turned into the film 12 Years a Slave. Yet it was fiction that best illustrated to people what slavery in the South was like. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1851 as a serial in a magazine. In 1852 it was published as a book and became a runaway bestseller, selling 300,000 copies in its first year. Eventually, it became a stage production. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, took a universal issue and translated it into individual terms. She wrote not about slavery, but about a slave. She dealt with slavery not at its worst, but at its best. The slave owner was kind, but the plantation suffered from soil exhaustion, so he was forced to sell off his slaves, including Tom. The slave trader, Simon Legree, was a northerner who eventually beat Tom to death. Stowe's portrayal of slavery revealed that it was the nature of the system that was immoral, not merely the slave owners. Stowe was able to get people to make an emotional commitment to do something about slavery. The conspiracy of silence that had settled over Congress following the Compromise of 1850 was broken in January of 1854 when Senator Douglas of Illinois introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Why did he introduce this bill? Well, here's some background information. Both the Kansas and Nebraska territories were located north of the Missouri Compromise line. There was a lot of violence in these unorganized territories just west of Missouri. Lots of criminal activity, outlaws, Indians, cowboys. Most of these people were either on the run from the law or did not like to live under the law. These people were not interested in having civilization moved in. They liked this area simply because there was no law. When gold was discovered on the American River in Northern California in 1848, gold fever hit and people wanted to go west where they could strike it rich. By 1850, the railroad had reached as far west as Chicago. With the discovery of gold, several railroad companies were eager to extend the railroad west to California. The Union Pacific line started in Chicago and went southwest right through these Badlands, that wild area west of Missouri. The locals did not welcome the railroad because it would bring civilization with it. As soon as rail lines were put down, locals would tear them up. They also ripped down the telegraph poles that were constructed along the rail route. Stephen A. Douglas was a stockholder in the Union Pacific Railroad. He felt that something positive was needed to rescue this territory from oblivion. Something needed to be done to entice people to come in and to be productive. The purpose of his Kansas-Nebraska Act was to bring law, order, and civilization to this territory. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had two parts. First was the establishment of two new territories north of the Missouri Compromise line that would eventually become states. The northern territory was Nebraska, the southern one was Kansas. Once established as territories, they would fall under the jurisdiction of the federal government, which would be responsible for providing law and order in these territories, bringing the outlaw element under control. Secondly was the need to get people to come into these territories. The Missouri Compromise line was restricting the free migration of people with their property. Douglas proposed that the peoples of these new territories decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery, to allow for popular sovereignty as had been done in New Mexico. This would effectively get rid of the Missouri Compromise line. Senators from slave-owning states were delighted. There was strong but divided support in the West. Northeasterners were strongly and passionately opposed to the act. Senator Douglas had the votes, and the act passed. Northeasterners planned to flood Kansas with people in favor of free soil. They organized immigrant aid societies in each state that would make available money and expertise to anyone who wanted to travel for free to Kansas and vote for Kansas to be a free state. Slowly, a trickle of free soilers began to move west. By fall, they were migrating in caravans, and then it became a flood. Free soilers established a series of settlements in eastern Kansas. By the winter of 1854-1855, there were sizable numbers of free soil groups that had established churches, stores, and hotels. Residents of western Missouri were not impressed with their new neighbors, whom they perceived as a threat to their way of life. 2 days before statewide elections were to be held, hordes of Missourians flooded into Kansas and declared residency. As a result, when the votes were tallied, the territory had elected a pro-slavery legislature. Free Soilers refused to recognize the elected legislature and governor and proceeded to hold their own elections, resulting in 2 competing systems of government, each claiming legitimacy. It was a standoff in Kansas until May of 1856, when a pro-slavery posse attacked the free soil town of Lawrence, an event known as the Sack of Lawrence. They shot up the town, set fire to the buildings, and rode off with 4 or 5 free soil ringleaders. Here is where the abolitionist John Brown enters our story. He felt divinely inspired and considered himself to be the hand of God. He gathered some of his supporters, including a couple of his sons, and rode into Pottawatomie Creek in southeastern Kansas, where they hacked up 5 pro-slavery supporters. This was not vengeance, but rather an execution. In his mind, he was acting out a sentence passed down from God. These 2 acts touched off a bloody civil war in Kansas, which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Hostilities lasted until after the Civil War was over. One could not work in the fields without armed guards, because ambush and attack were so prevalent. In reality, Kansas was the first battle site of the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had several consequences. It resurrected slavery as a political issue, it produced civil war and bloodshed in Kansas, and it transformed American politics. Democrats felt that because slavery was sanctioned by the Constitution, it was allowed and therefore available. Slavery was a matter for each state to decide for itself. Whigs refused to take a position on the issue of slavery. Their position was that slavery was not a political issue, but rather a matter of individual conscience. This position of taking no position split the party, eventually killing it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act convinced many young politicians, especially young Whigs, that the time had come to create a third party, an anti-slavery party. This is how the Republican Party came into existence. The majority of Republicans felt that there was nothing that could be done about slavery where it already existed, but they pledged to prevent its expansion into the territories. Looking back at this episode of the build-up to the Civil War, we have seen the United States expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The issue of slavery continues to divide the nation, leading to the rise of new political parties like the Free Soilers and the Republicans, and the demise of others, such as the Whigs. We've seen the death of the powerful defender of states' rights, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, as well as the rise of figures such as Stephen A. Douglas and John Brown, both of whom will play significant roles as we move into Part 3. And we've seen blood spilled on the soils of Kansas as they battle over the future of slavery in their state. Little did they know what their actions foreshadowed.